without further ado, we'll be starting the program. So I'm Kevin with the Secular Student Alliance, and so thank you for joining us here today. I'm happy to have Chrissy Stroop with us here. She is an ex-evangelical writer, speaker, and advocate. She happens to be the co-editor of the essay anthology Empty the Pews and a senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches. So her work is, I mean, you're sort of everywhere. I mean, Twitter has been like your haven lately. It's been fun watching you on Twitter. But yes, newspapers, magazines, peer-reviewed articles. She's everywhere.
I've had a weird life.
It's all good. It's all good. So yes, having attended right-wing evangelical schools in Indianapolis and Colorado Springs, you went on to get your BA in History and German from Ball State University, your PhD in Modern Russian history from Stanford, and then just happened to be an atheist and a nice critical voice of the Christian right. So it's sometimes easy to do. So without further ado, Chrissy Stroop is doing Out of Sight, Out of Mind, How Unregulated Christian Education Harms Children and American Society. Please take it away.
Thanks so much, Kevin. It's really great to join you. And as I was telling you earlier, I love doing student events. And just getting to interact with students. Being on a college campus is always great. And I know, as we were talking about, that in times like this, non-religious youth in particular need to find ways to plug into support groups, as many people will be in unsupportive homes. So I imagine a lot of you all out there in the audience may be able to relate to the kinds of things that I am discussing here. And, you know, if this has been some of your experience as well, you're certainly welcome to talk about that in Q&A. So in this presentation, I'm going to try to hit on all these points here: how unregulated Christian education harms children and American society. We'll talk a little bit about what unregulated means in this instance, and you know, what kind of regulations might be ideal and really compatible with a robust conception of the separation of church and state, though of course political solutions to these problems are probably pretty far off. And so I'll also talk about how we can leverage the power of stories to change the national conversation, and hopefully that way to make you know, new political possibilities become realizable in the future. But I'll talk a little bit about what we can do politically, and particularly at the grassroots and at the state level as well, to fight back against indoctrination and abuse of children in unregulated homeschooling and Christian schooling environments. So, all right. Oh, I think I need to click on this for, there we go. Now the slides are switching. So first of all, I've just got a little passage here from an essay that I have published on my blog at cstroop.com. So I graduated from high school from a school called Heritage Christian School in Indianapolis. I also went to elementary school there. In between, my family was in Colorado Springs. And so with the exception of half of sixth grade, and well, kindergarten, I was also in a public school. I was in Christian schools all my life, but we moved in the middle of sixth grade. So I ended up in a public school for a year, definitely contributed to some cognitive dissonance. But so here I'm just thinking back to elementary school in Indianapolis. And I mean, our school's called Heritage. That's a pretty, you know, big code word itself. And I just remember distinctly how we had this Bible verse, Psalm 33:12, up on the wall. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. We're talking a lot these days, or the press, you're seeing a lot of discussion about Christian nationalism. And that is definitely the kind of ideology that I grew up with. Unfortunately, I think we also see a lot of commentators trying to distinguish Christian nationalism from Christianity as if it is somehow outside of Christianity rather than a perfectly natural expression, at least of conservative Christianity, and something that is very much of a piece with what Christianity has mostly been throughout its history, at least since the 4th century when it merged with the power of the Roman imperial state. I do want to say up front that, you know, Christianity doesn't have to be that, and Christianity has sometimes sparked also liberationist movements. And so I want to give credit where credit is due there, but certainly Christian nationalism is a Christian phenomenon. It's a phenomenon in which its adherents seek to dominate. And we were literally taught that, you know, our country would be blessed if it was a godly country, and we would be punished if we disobeyed God. And mainly that meant we have to try to ban abortion, and we have to keep sticking it to the queers, you know, and I can say that because I am one. But we have to somehow stop all these gay people from having rights, and we have to put prayer back in schools. You know, those were sort of like the three main prongs. Though another thing that they fight for is simply the right to have these Christian schools and also homeschooling with all kinds of religious exemptions where they can get away with saying basically whatever they want and indoctrinating children. There have been some legal battles around this over the years going back to the 1980s. And well, you can also say before, I mean, there was the Supreme Court case Yoder versus Wisconsin, which has become an important precedent for homeschooling advocates. If memory serves, it was decided in 1973, around then. And that was the case that allowed the Amish to stop educating their children after grade 8. A lot of people don't know this, but there really is no federal right to an education in the United States. And the United States is the only member state in the United Nations that has not signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And Yoder is a very interesting precedent in the way that, you know, you might think, okay, well, the Amish are a very special case. But I have talked to many non-compliant Amish and former Amish who want the right to an education, don't want to be able to be forced not to have it, you know, so they don't like it. But it's also been used by more mainstream Christians to be able to indoctrinate their children, and also in many cases to isolate them so that they can be more severely abused physically and sexually. A whole lot of that happens in homeschooling and to some extent in Christian schools. So anyway, I'm going to give you an example now of just something from my own childhood, so we can start to reflect on what this looks like, you know, for actual kids in these kinds of environments before we start talking about the big picture again. So in school, we always had this idea of the biblical worldview just drilled into our heads. And it was associated with things like prayer in schools and banning abortion. I mean, even as a 6-year-old kid, you're being told there are all these liberals out there murdering babies and we have to stop them, which is, you know, really screws with your head. But of course, there are other things too. Anyway, that's me in 4th grade. And yes, I was, you know, raised as a boy, and I'm still continuing with my medical gender transition right now. And so next to me, there is a paper that I wrote in 4th grade that we were assigned to write. We were assigned to write a little essay on why I believe in creation. And as you can see, I was very good with repeating what the teachers wanted, because there's a big old A, good job on there. But let me just read some of this to you so you can kind of see how we were taught, even from that early an age, to craft arguments, yeah, very bad arguments, but nevertheless, the kinds of arguments that might sound intellectual to a lot of people, and that certainly did to us as kids, because we weren't, you know, these are all the adults in our lives are giving us this misinformation. So, you know, I start at the beginning. First of all, I want to talk about the law of entropy. It basically says anything organized tends to become disorganized after a while. Take your bedroom. You clean it up time after time, but eventually it will be messy again. If this law is true, how could so much order come out of chaos? Exclamation point, question mark. I believe that God created the world on purpose in an orderly way. Now there is pollution and lots of crime. Note how I here sort of shift to like an ethical consequentialist argument. Obviously, I didn't know those words in 4th grade, but this is also what they do. There's all this kind of sleight of hand and moving the goalposts. I mean, not that the science is right in the first place, obviously. The Bible says that each animal will produce its own kind. You won't wake up one morning and find a salamander in your fishbowl. This was how they taught us, you know, to debunk, quote unquote, evolution when we were kids in school, which obviously is not evolution's not like, you know, Pokemon evolution. But anyway, evolution says that by chance, a cosmic explosion formed what we call Earth. Our universe could not have started without a plan. Scientists are always making up new theories and covering up, I think I wrote, yeah, covering up old ones, okay. God and the Bible never change, and the Bible started near the beginning of time, right. Darwin wrote his theories in the late 1800s, okay, a little bit off. 1859 was the publication of Origin of Species. I guess that's arguably late. Eventually, he disagreed with himself. If this is not enough, here are some verses to look up in the Bible. This is why I believe in creation. Okay, so, you know, basically everything I just said there is completely false, but it's also what my teachers taught me as truth and wanted me to say. Darwin didn't recant, of course. I'm sure this audience all knows that, but that's a classic lie that many Christians tell about, you know, this deathbed conversion. There's a lot of love for the deathbed conversion, but these are, of course, alternative facts, and it is highly irresponsible to teach children these you know, assertions as facts when they are not. So this is actually, you know, one of the least horrible things that happens in these kinds of environments, but it's certainly one that is important enough, right? Children should have the right not to be indoctrinated in demonstrably false things. And, you know, I would not go so far as to say that children should be raised without exposure to religion at all, because I don't want to take that much of a right away from parents. And also religion can be, you know, a positive community building thing. It can take pro-social forms. It doesn't always have to be about believing false things. But for us, it was very much about believing false things, and then about trying to make everyone else believe those things too, and trying to control other people. You know, all of which is just very unhealthy. And so you get inculcated in this very unhealthy mentality. And even worse, these days, you know, this kind of stuff is taught very often with public funds. There's a great expose published by Rebecca Klein, the education reporter at Huffington Post, in 2017. She did a whole lot of data on schools that use two Christian schooling and homeschooling curricula that are published by, you know, Christian publishers, Bob Jones and Abeka. And so there are roughly 2,400 non-Catholic Christian schools in the United States that use those curricula and receive public funding. If we were to expand that to some of the other curricula that are out there, and also maybe include schools that aren't taking public funding, there would surely be a good number more, but it's impossible to say exactly how many. It is important to note that these are non-Catholic Christian schools, because as many problems as there can be with the Catholic education, and some Catholic schools are less ideological than others, some Jesuit academies are reasonably responsible. I mean, at least they do teach evolution. They don't teach six-day young earth creationism and all that sort of nonsense. And very often it's possible to be in those schools without being a Catholic, although certainly one might be socially ostracized. Anyway, so there's two links here, and I'll be happy to share these slides with Kevin if he wants to distribute them to people in the organization who might want them, or just share the links here. Rebecca Klein also wrote a more recent article drawing on this research that was completed in 2017, and talking about how the ideology that's explored, or well, that is presented as fact in these textbooks, contributes to the mentality of the people who invaded our capital on January 6th. So let's take a look at what's in some of these Bob Jones and Abeka textbooks. This is from that Huffington Post 2017 article. If you go to the website, it flashes through some different things, and I just made each one a slide. So, you know, this textbook calls Evolution a Destructive Faith. That's a classic right-wing Orthodox Christian talking point that everything is a religion, and so it's all, you know, a battle of religions against one another. Evolution is a religion, secular humanism is a religion, and so forth. This world history textbook says Jews plotted to kill Jesus. This book on social studies called Slavery, Black Immigration. So, these are some examples of also some quite pernicious things that are taught as facts in these Christian curricula that are frequently used in Christian schools and in homeschooling environments and subjected to little to no serious state regulation. And then this is a quote from that 2017 article in Huffington Post that this person was, exposed to these extremes, often talking about good and evil, heaven and hell, was taught in Christian school that to dance was to sin, that gay people were child molesters, and that mental illness was a function of satanic influence. All very common in evangelical Christian environments, these kinds of talking points. And even if people don't say out loud that, all gay people are child molesters, they often do hint about it, And even if some evangelicals admit that sometimes mental illness can be a real thing, there's a whole lot of spiritualizing of it. Well, if you could just pray more, believe in Jesus more, you wouldn't have to take those antidepressants. I mean, that's sort of the more benign form that view takes, and it's obviously not benign at all. Teachers at her school talked about slavery as Black immigration. Instructors called environmentalists hippie witches. I particularly like that one. So anyway, this kind of stuff is being taught in these environments, in many cases, in many states, with the use of voucher funding. That means your tax dollars are going to teach false and pernicious and antisocial things. And then this is from the more recent HuffPost article linking these kinds of textbooks and what they teach specifically to the kinds of people that we saw invading the Capitol in the video footage where they prayed in the well of the Senate, and they were holding and flying Christian flags and Jesus 2020 flags and that sort of thing. So scholars say that textbooks like these, with their alternative versions of history and emphasis on Christian national identity, represent one small part of the conditions that lead to events like last week's riots at the US Capitol. I would probably personally argue that it is a pretty important part of the condition, because this is one thing that right-wing Christians understand very well. When you can get children while they're young and indoctrinate them, you have a very powerful influence over those children's minds. And many of us who've come out of that, end up having a lot of psychological harm, as well as the social cost that comes from breaking with your family on religion and politics. So we saw a lot of obvious examples of Christian nationalism in this insurrection. And I want to link that to a couple of things that also happened not long before the insurrection, just before, like in the final weeks when we were waiting for Biden to be inaugurated, the Trump administration released its so-called 1776 report. And I want to pause on this for a minute and just note that many people who went to Christian schools or were homeschooled in Christian environments commented when they looked at this 1776 report when it came out, that it reflected pretty much the same ideas, the same talking points that you see in homeschooling and Christian schooling textbooks. It was that kind of Christian nationalist, white-centered history. This was the Trump administration's response, very bad, very sloppy response to the critically acclaimed 1619 project published in the New York Times that looks back at US history sort of through the lens of slavery and African-American history. And, according to the 1776 report, you don't want to look at that stuff. That's all for the globalists and the communists and so forth. I want to pause here too on just who two of the people were that were on that 1776 commission. Michael Ferris, he was the founder of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, the HSLDA, which is the single most important Christian right lobby that most Americans have never heard of. If you want to look at how homeschooling was basically deregulated from the point where it was relatively difficult to do in 1980 to the point where it's very easy to do, and even in states that have some kind of regulations on paper, there's not really any sort of enforcement mechanism with teeth today. That's the situation. Michael Ferris and the HSLDA, they that he had a lot to do basically as a lawyer with arguing those cases and deregulating homeschooling to the point where now it's really just sort of anything goes, sort of chaos. And then I should have put "and" in there. Those are two names, not one name. But Larry Arnn is the president of Hillsdale College, a private, conservative, explicitly conservative, very far right-wing college in Michigan. Pretty much a Christian college, although I think it's not officially a Christian college anymore. And so, yeah, the Trump administration was using these same people who are very much involved in Christian education to produce this report. So it's not really a surprise that it reflected the same sort of ideology that you get in the unregulated Christian education environment. And then another thing I want to emphasize just for a minute is how the fear was stirred up deliberately by Trump and the people around him, who in many cases are smarter and also more sincere in their right-wing Christian views. They stirred up this fear that if Democrats are in power, our country will be punished by God, right? That Democrats have no right to rule because they're rebelling against God. These are the kinds of things that they really believe. So let's get back to this whole idea then of, indoctrinating children in Christian schools. What's that like? And then let's start talking about how we can maybe push back against this. So yeah, as a 5-year-old kid, I was already being taught that, liberal is an antonym for Christian because Democrats murder babies. This is radicalizing rhetoric, right? I would say that thinking these kinds of ideas, believing these kinds of thoughts is the kind of thing that could make you think that a Democrat being the president is basically the end of the world, and you should, listen to Q and invade the Capitol to stop a Democrat from having, quote unquote, stolen the election, which obviously Joe Biden did not. That's a completely false narrative, but it's been pushed by a lot of people on the Christian right. So what can we do about this kind of fundamentalist indoctrination that flourishes along with abuses of all kinds in conservative Christian educational environments? So there are some potential legal avenues, but the short to medium term outlook for how they might work out is quite poor for the most part. I do think that over the long term, we should be working to deprive fundamentalist institutions of state and federal funding on church separation grounds. And I think that, it would be good if that were done at the federal level, though initially we're going to have to fight at the state level. But we might, with this SCOTUS, with Amy Coney Barrett on the SCOTUS, any ground that we might make could be taken right back. And I do think that Wisconsin v. Yoder and similar cases going back to the 1970s really should be overturned so that we can recognize that all children, all United States citizens, kids, have the right to a full education free of alternative facts. So I think it's also valuable to advocate for the United States to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We can advocate for secular standards in accreditation and fight for them in state level textbook battles. And in some states, those battles I think can be won, or they can at least be close. There's been some interesting battles in California in recent years. And I think if enough people care, we can win some state level battles and advocate for the sensible regulation of homeschooling. What would sensible regulation look like? I think even apart from textbooks, which is going to be a very sensitive issue, though I certainly think that we should fight about it, we can advocate for all students who are homeschooled to be overseen by, importantly, students who are homeschooled should probably have at least 2 medical appointments a year and maybe some other visits by what are called mandated reporters when we're talking about child abuse. Maybe have a social worker that works with them just to check in on them so that we can perhaps stop abuse from flourishing the way that it does, according to the testimonies of so many formerly homeschooled kids. in these kinds of environments. But then on the long-term front, and where I think we might also have some better success in the short to medium term, which in turn can turn into success in the long term, is trying to change the conversation in order to change public opinion and then shift what social scientists call the Overton window, right? That window of what is kind of acceptable to talk about in the political realm. It has been pushed and pushed to the right in recent decades. And because the right is very good at framing arguments, right? The right says religious liberty. What they really mean is liberty for Christians to dominate and discriminate against others. But it sounds good, right? So everyone's like, oh, well, you can't really object to religious liberty. So the way they frame religious liberty ends up shifting the Overton window to the right. But if we frame things in a different way and we participate in these debates and we talk about things like religious liberty and pluralism, but we define them in more liberal and inclusive ways, and we do that in conjunction with telling stories of people who have survived these kinds of hard-line Christian fundamentalist educations and backgrounds, I think that is going to be a fruitful way to work on public opinion and then shift the Overton window, make better political outcomes possible in the future. And we're going to talk a little bit about how one thing we can do with that is to use hashtag campaigns to create collective visibility for the kinds of people that I've been talking about. But first, just a couple words about the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Sure, the documents here that I'm showing you are old, but they're still on their website. And mainly with this one, I just want to show you how much of an emphasis they put on parents' rights over children's rights, and also how they do indeed cite Wisconsin v. Yoder and similar court cases there in order to make their arguments that homeschooling should be essentially unregulated by the state. And here, just sort of a quote from them talking about those things and including Wisconsin v. Yoder as a precedent that they use in their legal arguments, which is why I agree that ultimately, and it's not my original idea, I believe that one of the first people to really start talking about wanting to overturn Wisconsin v. Yoder is the ex-Amish author and activist Tora Bontrager. And so I kind of picked up on that from her. She's really cool. But now let's talk about what we could possibly do with hashtag campaigns and what the potential pitfalls there are, as well as what good could come out of it. So at the beginning of 2019, I started this hashtag campaign, Expose Christian Schools. And a lot of people started telling their stories. In fact, it was tweeted over 200,000 times in a couple of days. And, I put liberal media in quotes there, by which I just mean, mainstream media and quote unquote normal media, not Fox News and not town hall sort of media, which is more propaganda than news, right? But as you can see, we did get covered in the Associated Press. We also did get covered in the New York Times. But unfortunately, there was a major troll attack organized on 4chan. I have the screenshots documenting all of that. They went after the Jewish journalist who was working on this article. And I have to say, I gave him very, very bad advice. I recommended that he just turn to Twitter to look for sources. Well, by this time, the hashtag had trended pretty big and the trolls were wanting to fight back against it. And so they just inundated his mentions, lots of vile anti-Semitism. And this ended up weakening the article that ultimately came out in the New York Times, though it's still, I think, an accomplishment that an article got in the New York Times at all. And just let me give you some examples here of the kinds of things that people were sharing under this hashtag. For example, if you can see at the top there, this @Laura_Hagen tweeted that my school had slave day. So there was an auctioneer with a whip and juniors would be owned by seniors for a day. We couldn't have prom/dances, but we had slave day. Hashtag expose Christian schools. Here's someone else, a spiritual counselor at my school outed my good friend as gay under the guise of him needing prayer. That can have really severe consequences in these kinds of schools, including ultimately expulsion. So obviously very bad behavior, but very common. Other bullshit things I was taught. Gay people are evil. Being black is from the mark of Cain. The Pope is the Antichrist. It's the end of the world. The concept of sexual purity. Men have dominion over women, etc., etc. So, you know, it's one thing for one person to tweet this kind of stuff and maybe not get that much attention, or people can write it off as, well, that's just the extremes. But when you get 200,000 tweets and most of them are this kind of stuff, it really makes a splash. People see it. I think we do need to work on demanding better from journalists who cover this sort of thing, that they take it seriously. And particularly when you look at television news, the hashtag was featured on Fox and Friends, and that was actually featured on Fox and Friends twice, but they never mentioned where it originated. They didn't mention that I had launched it, or that what it was primarily used for was actual kids who were educated in Christian schools talking about their bad experiences. They of course represented it as a liberal plot. There was no counterpoint to that on CNN or MSNBC, and I think that they are afraid of what might look like criticizing Christianity. And when you look at what happened to Dan Levin, there are obvious reasons to be afraid that you're going to get some pushback, but we need to be willing to have that pushback happen. And I think we honestly need to stop pretending that many on the Christian right are arguing in good faith, and basically stop coddling them, if you ask me. So yeah, here's a couple more. Numerous queer and trans students were forced to undergo counseling and have been threatened to be outed to parents, lose scholarships, etc. I put a poster on my locker for Trans Day of Visibility. The poster was defaced with rude comments. When I went to the vice principal about it, not only did he refuse to act, but he reprimanded me for putting the poster on my locker. None of that is surprising, but okay, let's kind of pull back and talk about maybe a few big picture lessons here. When you want to talk about these things and you want to get the media to talk about them, and you want to get more representation for secular people, and one of the things that we hope will come out of that is ultimately being able to have more sensible legal regulations about education and separation of church and state in the realm of education. Here are some pieces of advice that I think it's good to do. First of all, and this is going to always be controversial in atheist spaces, avoid blanket anti-theism. What do I mean by that? Comments like, you know, all religion is just a bunch of believing in sky daddies and it's for stupid people. You know, first of all religion is not really a thing. And there are some religions where you can practice, you know, you can do the rituals, you can participate in community without believing in God at all. Right. So, and there are more important features of even some branches of Christianity than believing in things that are not demonstrable. And there are branches of Christianity that don't demand that people believe in false things. So as much fun as blanket religion bashing can feel, you know, and it's also understandable, it can be cathartic when you've been hurt by religion. I think taking a step back, trying to sort of be the bigger person and understand that, you know, religion is a big blanket phenomenon, and we're going to have to work with religious people to get better outcomes. It's best to avoid the blanket across the board anti-theism and speak with a level of nuance, and also mostly speak to what you know, right? So I mostly focus on conservative Christianity, particularly on evangelicals, because that's the background I come from. I've also studied it more from an outside and academic perspective, but, you know, I'm not an expert on Islam. I don't speak Arabic or read it. And so I don't have a lot to say about Islam, but in general, I can say that Islam and Christianity both have a lot of diversity under those big umbrellas. We need to be aware of that, which leads to the second point. We need to build coalitions, political coalitions around shared values, and understand that at least in that space, the shared values have to be more important than the shared beliefs. And I can tell you from personal experience that there are a lot of great social justice Christians, to say nothing of members of other religions that you can work with, and who are willing to respect you as equal, but of course you have to respect them as equal as well, and sort of work for equal rights for all of us. But there are great religious organizations out there. One that I've worked with a number of times is the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. And yeah, you heard that right. It's a pro-reproductive justice, you know, pro-choice, pro let's have legal abortion religious organization. And they do interfaith work. So I also give talks and I do panel discussions with organizations like that, because I think that people in secular communities and religious communities who agree on things like the separation of church and state need to be talking to each other and working together if we want to have better political outcomes in the future. And then advocating for secular representation in political structures is, of course, important. I've been really appreciative of the work of Sarah Levin in recent years, who has done so much to get atheists and agnostics, non-believers, and the non-religious in general recognized as making important contributions to American cultural life in the Democratic Party. I don't think this would go anywhere in the Republican Party right now. So I say political structures in general, that's an ideal. It would be nice to be able to do this in multiple parties, but it's really only happening in one right now. And I think we need to keep pushing for more of that in the Democratic Party, because of course, if you look at like Joe Biden's recent speeches and things, you don't see a lot of this, right? But this is more at the level of the DNC. There's been great strides in recognizing secular people and creating secular representation in the political party. And then kind of building on the first point, I say we should all learn to speak intelligently about pluralism and religious freedom in order to change the national conversation. And that means we want to shift the frame, right? So when we talk about living with pluralism, we talk about what that looks like, and sometimes there are some hard problems to solve there, when everyone is treated equally in the public square. We're not navigating pluralism in a fair and democratic way if, for example, a baker can refuse to bake gay wedding cakes, right? That is an example of discrimination. I think that if we kind of combine these tactics, share stories, and then work on all of this on this more abstract plane, that will be a good way to work toward an environment where we can have healthier regulations and children don't have to grow up being indoctrinated in religious extremism. So that's, pretty much the end of my presentation. And now I will be happy to open it up for your questions and comments. And let's see, I need to figure out how to just get back on the main screen here.
If you stop at the top, stop your sharing, it should pop back.
Okay, I think I minimized wait, how do I maximize this? Sorry, I'm not the best tech person.
Happens to all of us.
Where is stop sharing? I just see a new share. I don't see stop sharing. Sorry, everybody.
I just did it for you.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Appreciate that.
So I think while you were sort of wrapping up, you were doing a little bit of information about what some of the things that we can do to sort of make this better. And Stephen had a question. He says we sort of like we need our own Project Blitz. He said, but that takes real money and greater organization across this atheist, free thought, humanist community. How can we as a non-theist community join forces and work together more closely to gain more attention among the public and in the courts?
That's a great question. And I think that we should approach that with at least two prongs. One is, now I know the Christian right has a whole lot of money. They've got these huge lobbying organizations, and some of them are much more famous than the one that I highlighted in this talk, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I mean, there's also the Family Research Council. There's Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum. There's a whole bunch of them. They've got a lot of money. And that is a problem. Conservatives have a lot of money to spend on radicalizing extremist projects. But I would say there are already a lot of great organizations out there representing the secular community who are fighting the battles in the legal realm. And so one thing we can do is, if we have the ability to, join organizations like Freedom from Religion Foundation or American Atheists as a paying member, that certainly helps, right? Because they are out there fighting these battles. Also, the Military Religious Freedom Foundation and Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, and a number of others. So we have lobbies on our side, and we can certainly, give them some of our resources to the extent that we may have money to spare. Students may not have a lot of money to spare. I'm still a struggling writer. I don't have a lot of money to spare, but I give a little bit. And if we all gave a little bit, it would make a difference. But I do think then, as younger people, and okay, you're gonna laugh because I'm 40 years old, but I'm still gonna put myself in that category. I am, right on the cusp between millennials and Gen X generationally. But I know how to use social media, right? I'm verified on Twitter with 57,000 followers. And if we got together and organized a little bit more to talk about things like I was talking about today on social media, I think we could get more media coverage. We could be more savvy about how we did it, how we organize these things. Because I was really just kind of dinking around, to be honest, in 2019. I didn't know that hashtag was going to blow up, and I didn't especially try to make it blow up. But with organization, we could do more things like that, where we could make these media campaigns that you can reach a lot of people on social media, and a lot of us have the technology at home to put together, some pretty slick videos, or audio files, or TikToks or whatever, and TikTok, okay, I guess I am old because I can't really do TikTok, I don't know, but I like to watch TikToks. All the ones I tried to make are terrible, but social media is a way to get people's attention, and sometimes it's a way then to actually reach, media and start to change the national conversation. I think highlighting the stories of people who have left high control religious groups is something that's very important to do right now, and that's that was one of the reasons that I wanted to publish this anthology of essays with my friend Lauren O'Neill, Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church. We're working on a second volume that expands the conversation beyond Christianity. And I think the more we try to get things like that in the public eye, the better.
Oh, that's great, thank you. And I think American Atheist has a fantastic sort of secular game plan for looking at states and looking at what's happening in the courts. And again, Allison and Jeffrey are completely on top of it. FFRF, they have a floor of lawyers who this is the sort of stuff they eat for lunch every single day. So we happen, as Secular Student Alliance, American Atheist and American United are right now representing us in a lawsuit against the Department of Education, and specifically looking at the Betsy DeVos and the Trump administration really gave power and legitimacy for public institutions, public colleges, to have to fund Christian organizations who intentionally wanted to not follow the discrimination policies. And so the large brunt of that is LGBT plus kids, other non-minority religions, exactly, and the non-religious. And so we, last year, before sort of COVID started, we actually saw from I think the more conservative realm of Christian students, increased harassment and increased animus towards our non-religious students. And some of those things you shared, we sort of saw that as well. A couple little questions. Some people were asking, do you know the percentages of the percentage of children that are being homeschooled in the US, and then sort of a follow-up, what percentage go on to attend public university?
Those are great questions, and I don't think that we have that exact data. I do remember that, so if you want to look at what the sort of the latest data is that we do have, American Atheists also puts out this annual State of the Secular States report, with reports for individual states, but also kind of big picture perspective. And they had a whole nice sidebar article on homeschooling this year and some of the issues with it. It could be, I think, in the single digits, but it could be as high as maybe up to 10%. I don't think it's 10%, but yeah, it's probably 5 or below. But what happens is, when you're educated in that kind of environment, and also that wouldn't be including Christian schools, but I don't know if anybody has the data on that. These folks tend to be mobilized and highly engaged politically, and pushed to engage politically for a particular culture warring politics, social right-wing politics from a very early age. You get taken to anti-abortion protests. In my Christian school, when we were juniors and seniors, we were taken to sort of Tea Party before the Tea Party conventions. We went to this statewide organization called Citizens Concerned for the Constitution, their annual convention. We picked up their voter guides, and then we were mobilized to, on school time, stuff those voter guides into envelopes and send them out direct mail to parents and people who were affiliated somehow or just supported the school. And these voter guides are a great way to get around the issues of being a 501c3, right? Because you're not advocating for a candidate, you're just telling people, who scores well on your views on abortion and homeschooling and prayer in schools or whatever. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
No problem. And I think your presentation has been looking at sort of intentionally looking at the damage being caused by Christian education and really the lack of education that's really taking place and how that's impacting, and that continues on up the line as they grow up and in politics and raid the Capitol and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I remember the point I was building toward is that while this is a relatively small number of people, they punch politically above their weight. And in fact, it's white evangelicals are one of the main groups that emphasize homeschooling, like sometimes traditionalist Catholics as well, and just outright overt white supremacist groups. They're all really big on homeschooling. The John Birch Society is really big on homeschooling. And so, yeah, they're active. This is often why, and also often because liberal homeschooling families don't understand that, not wanting the government to regulate your homeschooling is, they often deny the problem of fundamentalism and abuse. And so they join with the conservative homeschoolers in trying to oppose any state level regulation. So we do need to get people mobilized if we're going to fight that kind of thing at the state level. But also look at white evangelicals. They are now down to 15 or 16% of the population, but they're still a quarter of the electorate.
Yeah. And Laura asked, she said she did in high school, she did a paper on the Amish, and you sort of touched on Wisconsin versus Yoder multiple times. So do you think that Wisconsin versus Yoder was an example of Protestant exceptionalism? Why or why not?
Well, that is a very interesting question. And I think, yeah, it's fascinating to sort of counterfactually discuss, would they have done something similar for a group that was not Protestant? Would we have been so accommodating if we had had sort of a Muslim minority that wanted to live basically in the 19th century? I'm not sure we would. I mean, obviously we do have ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities, many of them concentrated in and around New York City and the boroughs, where they also don't educate past a certain grade. Don't quote me on exactly what it is, but I think the boys stop after 3rd or 5th grade, because then they're supposed to just devote all of their time to the Torah. And the girls actually get educated for a little bit longer because they're supposed to be more worldly and kind of be the breadwinners in some of those environments. So it's not exclusively a Christian or a Protestant phenomenon, but I think that using Yoder as a precedent, I mean, it mostly has kind of redounded to the benefit of Protestants, yes, because a lot of this pushback on what has happened since the 1960s does come from Protestants who were mad that Protestant supremacism in the public schools, which was a real thing, and Catholics had real reasons to object to that in the 19th and into the middle of the 20th century. That Protestant supremacism in public schools was being pushed back against legally. So I guess you could say it might be an example of specifically Protestant exceptionalism. I think that in the popular discourse, maybe the way that we think about the Amish as kind of these pure, wonderful Protestants, yeah, that probably is kind of an example of Protestant exceptionalism.
And Dennis had a question: is how do you respond to Christians who always respond to the mere suggestion of Christian nationalism? So, you'd say, oh, Christian nationalism, and they go, oh, you just hate Christians. What's your response to that?
I mean, usually my response is to block them on Twitter. No, but I mean, to be honest, people who are that far gone, you're not going to change their mind. And so you can decide whether or not you think there's any value in trying to debate people like that. I generally don't. I don't write the stuff that I write for them. I want them to be politically sidelined and deprived of power. I want them to be exposed before the general American public, because too much of the liberal public really doesn't know how much power they have or what they're doing. And I think that if we can shift the national conversation, you know, their political power would start to be diminished. I mean, it's true they have a lot of money, they have a lot of access, and the electoral college, and you know, the way that we do representation with 2 senators from every state, and not to mention voter suppression and still gerrymandering, gives them disproportionate power. You know, if the Senate and the House actually represented the country, Democrats would have a much more solid margin in those places right now. But they don't, because of the way that American federalism is structured in the Constitution. So there's a lot to push back against as far as that goes. But yeah.
We'll do this as the last question because we're sort of almost rounding out our hour. And so I want to respect your time and everyone else's as well.
I talk way too long.
No, it went quick. So Mark was saying I was taught that Christian values, and the reason I love this question is because I saw you and Andrew talking about Christian values, and I've seen some of your stuff on Twitter. But it was taught that Christian values are the reason why we have a good society and must be respected. So not questioned or challenged as well. So would you consider this less nefarious? It's a loaded question.
But I consider what less nefarious than what? I didn't quite follow.
I think saying Christian values are the reason why we have a good society, rather than sort of the big focus on homeschooling, all the Christian sort of stuff in homeschooling.
No, because it's all of a piece, right? There is a big, you know, structural issue in our country with Christian supremacism or Christian hegemony, whatever you want to call it. And I think we need to work on deconstructing that by advocating for secular representation everywhere. Is it okay if I answer Abby Hafer's question here about a book on science denial?
Of course.
I saw that pop up, and she was asking for sources. So in addition to the Huffington Post pieces there, and just looking at the Exposed Christian Schools hashtag, probably the greatest place you could start with that would be Julie Ingersoll's book called Building God's Kingdom Inside the World of Christian Reconstruction. 2 excellent chapters on homeschooling and Christian schools and how their influence has become so broad beyond just narrow little ideological circles. So I'd absolutely recommend that book.
Great. And I will say, I think one of the interesting, as you were sort of going over your paper from, I think it was 4th grade, it was, I think, still striking how some of the language that you were using then is still clearly embedded in what we're hearing today, and how that has not changed. And I think someone mentioned Project Blitz in here in Wales, that is just the stepping stone for Project Blitz and what's happening, and how we've continued over the past few years to see that grow. Now, granted, they rebranded recently because they realized, you know, we were on to them. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that capacity. And I also, as you were talking, some of the points that you were talking about in the Christian school literature, homeschooling literature, how that has now made it into Texas textbooks, which Texas now decides basically what all the states are going to buy. And I wish living in California, I wish California would block buy so we could help decide that a little bit more.
Yeah. Run for school board. You know, I mean, this is one place where people can really make a difference in local and state battles, potentially uphill battles in some states. But I think if we get enough visibility, we get enough people excited, I think we can win in some places. And I mean, it's really interesting, some of the things that are happening in Texas. It's not, you know, as red as it used to be, just to take Texas as an example. Or look at what happened to Georgia in the last elections. So I think, you know, if we focus on the right communication strategy, and we work on building collective visibility, and we just get people out there doing basic advocacy and canvassing and talking to people, you know, we can win some of these battles. But we have to put up the same kind of energy that the you know, Christian homeschooling lobby puts up. But yeah, I mean, to your comment, there's one other thing I want to say, which is that the Christian right, they try to grab children wherever they can. So they're trying to isolate children, as many children as possible, and take them out of what they call government schools, or sometimes call indoctrination centers, meaning public schools, which, if you were educated in public schools, did you know you were indoctrinated in the religion of secular humanism? That's what they think. And at the same time, they're trying to infiltrate public schools, right, with these Project Blitz type bills, make everyone, post "In God We Trust" in every classroom and so forth. So yeah, they're trying to just take control and discriminate against people of other faiths and of no faith everywhere they can, and to keep their own kids, isolated, which is what abusers do, right? They isolate victims.
No, yeah. Yeah, and I isolate their own kids and then force a lot of their values, their beliefs, not values, beliefs on the public at large by changing that so that we all have to and somewhat imbibe in their religion. So I want to thank you very much. I love the time we spent, and thank you for giving up some of your day. Truly appreciate it.
Not at all. Thanks so much for having me, Kevin.
Yeah.
As I said, I love doing student events.
No, fantastic. And I just want to say, for people who are interested, Secular Strategy with Sarah Levin. She's looking for people in states who want to get excited and want to really do things in their states. She's super helpful. I mean, fantastic. I was a woman, fantastic person. You'll love her. American Atheist and FFRF have tons of stuff going on in states. And yeah, American Atheist just put out their secular state guide, the youth guide that we did with them. The next one that's coming out is, I think, People of Color guide, and talking about secular stuff. So their survey they did is absolutely fantastic. And of course, you can always visit Secular Student Alliance, support our students who are on campuses and middle schools, high schools, and colleges now. So truly appreciate it. So again, thank you very much. It's great having you, and really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been great to be here.
Wonderful. We'll see you later.
Bye.
Bye.